Hello humans, welcome back to the Make Waves podcast. Now, if you know me in real life, I have been living overseas in Japan for the last 3 years. Since the COVID-19 pandemic and border restrictions were lifted after the 2021 Tokyo Olympics, Japan has seen a boom in tourism. 2025 is now more than halfway over, but from January to April of this year alone, more than 15 million people have already visited Japan. Most of these tourists are also from the East Asian region, with the biggest countries being South Korea, China, and Taiwan. There's been a little over 1 million American tourists who entered Japan since the beginning of this year, and this is also a 30% increase from the year prior. Now, I will say, fascination with Japan and the globalization of Japanese culture is not new. It's been around for decades. But data and also modern pop culture is showing us that Japan is really of global interest right now. Major music musicians like Megan Thee Stallion have collaborated with Japanese artists. Japanese trends are getting lots of attention on social media. We're seeing companies like Oishi Berry, which uses indoor vertical farming to grow high-quality Japanese strawberries in New York City, have incredible success in their first few years of business and really revolutionized the American agricultural industry. The matcha market also grew almost $1 billion last year, and it is expected to grow into a more than $6 billion industry by 2029. It is undeniable that Japan is very popular right now, and for good reason. But something I hear often on social media that I cannot agree with is that Japan is, quote, living in 2050. I can understand where this idea comes from. It makes sense to think this way if you're only visiting Japan for a few weeks, especially if you come from a country like the United States. But after living in both the countryside and city centers of Japan for years now, I can confidently say that Japan is not living in 2050, and actually, a lot of the country is behind the rest of the world. Now let me explain. When I first came from the United States to Japan, I was in awe of the functionality of the country. There's this labyrinth of public transportation that is almost always on time. Guns are illegal, healthcare is nationalized. It felt like this is one of the most advanced countries in the world, and a big part of me does still feel this way. But I think this is where American tourists get it wrong. Japan is not ahead because the cities are clean or healthcare doesn't bankrupt you. America is just very far behind. Americans have been brainwashed to accept a subpar standard of living they are told is number one in the world. Japan seems like a social utopia when you're used to living in the United States because it's like eating a full sandwich after being starved on breadcrumbs. Now, one thing Japan is very well known for is its advancement in technology. In the 1980s, Japan experienced a huge tech boom with the shift towards an information-based economy. Japan became a global leader in things like semiconductors, high-speed rail, robotics, and personal electronics. Today, Japan does have robots serving you food in restaurants, bathtubs that you can reheat with the push of a button, and probably the best toilets in the entire world. Just last year, a big group of telecommunication companies in Japan said that they were already experimenting with 6G prototype devices. I feel like the rest of the world just got 5G, and some places on Earth still don't even have basic internet. So of course, in a technological sense, Japan is very advanced. They are global leaders in technology, and I expect that to be true for the foreseeable future. However, in the last 20 to 30 years, Japan is also seeing a decline in the tech industry, and this is for a few reasons. The first is the, quote, inward-facing character of the Japanese tech industry. Top IT firms built operating systems, database management tools, and software only to fit the niche of Japanese corporations and society, which essentially shut out opportunities in the global market. There are also the constraints of Japan's traditional employment system. Japanese salaries for software developers or tech specialists are very low in comparison to places like the United States, which is home to the big tech giants. This pay gap turns people away from staying in the IT industry in Japan when they could simply move overseas and earn much higher wages. And the bigger problem is that low wages in Japan are not just in tech. In 2023, the OECD, or Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, reported that Japan is one of the lowest developed countries for annual average income. At the time, the average income in America was 2.5 times higher than in Japan, and 3.3 times higher in countries like Switzerland. Japan's wages have remained pretty much unchanged in the last 30 years, and this is cause for concern, especially since, like many countries in the world, the cost of living in Japan is also on the rise. I think one of the most outdated and potentially frustrating things about living in Japan is the bureaucracy. There's often an excessive amount of red tape for what should be simple procedures. Places like city halls, banks, real estate agencies all have their own unique policies and procedures, and what you think might be an afternoon errand can turn into an all-day or all-week event. Figuring out the proper order of steps for things like getting a phone number, opening a bank account, or signing a housing contract becomes this incredibly complex and confusing puzzle. To get a phone number, you need a bank account. But to get a bank account, you need an address. But to get that address, you first need a phone number. All of which you usually need a special Japanese stamp called a hanko to even sign these contracts. And if you're a foreigner with a foreign last name, companies may ask you to get a second hanko stamp with the English version of your name, since the kanji hanko is not a direct translation. Yes, this is me speaking from personal experience, and I can pretty much guarantee that if you have lived in Japan for any significant amount of time, you have had at least one nightmare bureaucracy story. It is also the way that Japan's bureaucratic system operates that is outdated. Even in 2025, many companies and municipal buildings still heavily rely on the use of fax machine. And some documents are only accepted by physically mailing in paper copies through a postal service.
Thank you so much for waiting. Hello.
Hi, I'm here to submit these documents.
Oh, of course. Let me see.
Is there a problem?
These documents need to be delivered by postal mail. I'm so sorry.
Oh, okay. Where should I send them to?
This office.
Oh, okay. Well, is there a name that I should make it out to when I send it?
Yes, Yamamoto Taro.
Okay, who is that? Me.
This concept of bureaucracy reminded me of this book that I read recently, which is called Capitalist Realism by Mark Fisher. The overall theme of the book discusses how it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, and it goes into analysis about the individual parts, people, places, and things that make up the whole of the capitalist system. One of the chapters in this book is titled "There is No Central Exchange," and it talks about how one of the aspects of postmodern capitalism is this kind of ocean of bureaucracy that can create these feelings of frustration and anger. I want to share a small quote from this chapter. Anger can only be a matter of venting. It is aggression in a vacuum, directed at someone who is a fellow victim of the system, but with whom there is no possibility of communality. Just as the anger has no proper object, it will have no effect. In this experience of a system that is unresponsive, impersonal, centerless, abstract, and fragmentary, you are as close as you can to be confronting the artificial stupidity of capital in itself. The system of Japanese bureaucracy is like this, centerless, fragmented, outdated in a lot of its methodologies. Japan is very much a by-the-book, rule-following society, and I have learned that there's a sort of groveling you have to do, especially as a foreigner, if you want to exist in a system that constantly gives you procedures that almost always reveal more obstacles. It ends up requiring a lot of effort to maintain basic life necessities, and this is an added responsibility that you have to accept if you want to live in Japan long term. Not to mention that these issues become 10 times harder when you add in the problem of a language barrier. Of course, it's hard to get an exact figure, but studies estimate that only 20 to 30% of the Japanese population speaks English fluently. The 2024 English Proficiency Index ranked Japan 92nd out of 116 countries, and 16 out of 23 in Asia. This is interesting considering that Japan is also one of the most educated countries in the world. The problem is that English and Japanese are linguistically completely different, so learning English as a native Japanese speaker, or the other way around, is incredibly difficult, and it takes years of committed study to really become proficient. A 2011 study conducted by the University of British Columbia found that English language skills weren't really all that important when it came to career advancement in Japan. For businesses in the hospitality industry in major tourist cities like Tokyo, Kyoto, Osaka, speaking English might feel like a necessary skill, but overall, there is not a strong financial incentive for Japanese people to learn English. A lot of their careers just simply don't require it. I think it's also important to mention the historical context and how it contributed to the exclusion of the English language of Japan. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Japan was mostly self-isolated from the rest of the world during the Edo period, but this changed in 1854 when Japan was forced open to trade by the United States. This was at a time of rampant colonization around the world, and global trade was booming during the Industrial Revolution. But Japan wasn't really in this mix until the mid-19th century, and it didn't start doing so willingly. Japan had essentially missed hundreds of years of English language exchange at a time in history when other regions of the world were already being swallowed by the sea of colonialism. The lighting has changed quite a bit, but don't let it distract you from my point. I am not an expert in all of Japanese history, but I think it's interesting that when you look at the historical background, it is possible that English not being widely spoken originally started as a form of resistance to colonization happening at that time. Now, it would be remiss of me to mention Japan and colonization without also mentioning their own role in colonization throughout the Asian Pacific region. The Empire of Japan, or Imperial Japan, started with the Meiji Restoration in 1868, and it ended in 1947 after the end of World War II. During this time, Japan colonized many countries in the region. This included Korea, parts of mainland China, Philippines, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. Many countries in the Asian Pacific region were under Japanese occupation until the end of World War II. To this day, many people in Japan, especially in government, still do not acknowledge the many war crimes that happened during its imperial era, especially as it relates to sexual violence. Historians estimate that up to 200,000 women and young girls were forced into sexual slavery by the Japanese military before and during World War II. Now, there is irrefutable evidence that the Japanese government was directly involved in establishing and organizing the sexual slavery system, but the government has continued to deny and diminish the experience of victims for many decades. In 1994, the Japanese government did set up a private sector fund called the Asian Women's Fund to distribute what they called, quote, atonement money. But many of the victims have demanded compensation directly from the Japanese government, along with more open public discourse and an accurate account of the many human rights violations that they endured. There has been lots of back and forth about this issue, especially between Japan and South Korea. In 2015, there was a joint agreement between Japan and South Korea to, quote, finally and irreversibly resolve the issue of comfort women. But this deal was met with a lot of criticism because many of the South Korean women who survived sexual slavery said that this agreement was reached without even consulting them. While this deal did improve relations between Japan and South Korea, many people questioned if the political success was at the expense of disregarding victims' lived experience. There is also concern about the, quote, irreversibility of this agreement, and the legal battle for justice has continued on in recent years. In 2021, South Korean women who were victims of sexual slavery filed a lawsuit against Japan. And at first, a Seoul court ruled that the sexual slavery system constituted as a human rights violation. However, just a few days later, another panel of judges at the same district court dismissed a similar case that was filed against Japan in 2019. They dismissed the case, saying that arguing on the grounds of international state immunity would inevitably create a diplomatic clash. But in 2023, this dismissal was overturned by a Seoul High Court appeal, ruling that Japan did not have international state immunity for its war crimes against these women. Japan's reaction to this ruling was less than supportive, with their Ministry of Foreign Affairs website calling the High Court ruling, quote, clearly contrary to international law, therefore extremely regrettable and absolutely unacceptable. Japan has remained committed to downplaying the severity of these crimes, and acting like this issue can never be brought up again because of a single diplomatic deal, especially one that never even consulted the original victims, is ridiculous. This brings me to my final point about why Japan is behind the rest of the world, and this is in their treatment towards women, both past and present. Tourists come to Japan and see women-only train cars and think that Japan loves women, but the reason that these things even exist is because of large-scale sexual harassment and assault, with things like groping and upskirting during crowded commutes. Japanese society is still deeply misogynistic, and sexual harassment is everywhere: universities, workplaces, even in the government. Just last year, the leader of the Conservative Party of Japan made heinous suggestions about how to raise the low birth rate. He suggested that women over the age of 18 should not be allowed to go to university, and that single women over the age of 25 would be banned by law from getting married for the rest of their lives. The most disgusting suggestion was to force women over the age of 30 to have hysterectomies, surgically removing their uterus in order to put pressure on women to have children at an earlier age. Of course, these comments were met with an uproar of criticism, and he later apologized, but it's very concerning that a politician can make such egregious comments with having little to no consequences. It's interesting because the low birth rate in Japan is a problem, In 2024, Japan had less than 700,000 new births, which is a 5.7% decrease from the year prior. This is a new record low, and it is also the 9th consecutive year of decline in Japan's birth rate. So of course, people are concerned about the implications and what this means for the longevity of the country. But it seems like people are trying to brainstorm new ways to solve this problem without acknowledging the obvious answer. Treat women better. Do not just force women to have babies. Create a society where they're actually supported in doing so. The government should be focused on making it easier for people to have children and addressing the social issues and stigmas that are actively causing harm. The reality is that how you treat women affects the future of your societies. And I think Japan will have to face this truth head on if they want to reverse the plummeting birth rates. Now, I've spent quite a long time telling you all the reasons why Japan is not living in 2050, and honestly, I feel like the list keeps going on. Women hold very few spots in parliament. I'm talking less than 50%. Access to morning after pills are very difficult, and it requires both parties to consent, meaning you need a man's permission to take an emergency contraceptive pill. There's a huge gap in the division of domestic labor, like housework and childcare, likely another thing contributing to the low birth rate. Single-use plastic is everywhere, mental health is still taboo, and same-sex marriage is still illegal nationwide. Now, please do not mistake me for a hater, because there are so many things I love about Japan as well, and if enough people are interested, I would happily make another video about that. I just think it's important we don't confuse technological innovation with forward thinking. Yes, Japan is incredibly advanced when it comes to things like robotics and infrastructure, but that doesn't mean the whole of the country is progressive. A futuristic society is not just about bullet trains or AI, it's about how people are treated, especially women. Is there support for work-life balance? Are people actually protected from harm? Is the government actually focused on the well-being of people, or is it too caught up in the perfectionism of statistics? This is the kind of societal evolution that really matters. Tech is cool, but it shouldn't distract us from the deeper human side of progress. And that is definitely a topic for a later episode, so I will end this here. Thank you so much for being here. Please like, share, comment, subscribe, and I hope you continue to speak up and use your voice to make waves. I'll see you next week.